spice extends life. The spice expands consciousness.
Hello and welcome to Conversations with Dr. Greer. This is Dr. Stephen Greer, and I'd like to thank the folks at the World Puja Network for hosting us every 2 weeks here to give you an update on disclosureproject.org and the orionproject.org and the work that CSETI is doing. So it's a wonderful opportunity, and I do want to thank the folks there for hosting us every 2 weeks. Today I'm joined with a really dear friend and someone who's been a person who's helped with the work that we've done with the Disclosure Project for nearly, or more than actually, a decade, and it's Paola Harris, and she's a teacher and a researcher in the UFO subject. She was living in Rome, Italy, when I first got to know her, and she's now living in Colorado. She had been involved in studying this matter all the way back to the time of J. Allen Hynek, and who was, of course, as many people know, the Project Blue Book head, who eventually sort of defected from the party line that none of this could be true, and became someone who quite openly stated that there was something very real happening, and most likely it was an extraterrestrial origin. And so Paula's been involved for a very long time in the subject and has a rich history, and very importantly had helped me a great deal when I'd be in Italy meeting with Disclosure Project witnesses, airline pilots and Vatican officials and the Vatican Observatory astronomer officials, as well as Monsignor Balducci, who is a senior theologian to Pope John Paul, whose interview we also have that many people have seen at disclosureproject.org and in the materials. So, Paula, thank you for joining us today.
It's a real pleasure, Stephen. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, good. Well, why don't you share with folks a little bit about your background and the experiences you've had studying this subject, and particularly with Disclosure Project, so they get a sense of how that unfolded for you.
Well, Stephen, I was really lucky because I began working with Dr. J. Allen Hynek in 1979 after I saw the movie Close Encounters, and I happened to go up to Evanston, Illinois, and he came out of his CUFOS office and asked if I would do his Italian translations. And then he would come to Boulder, Colorado, because I was living here then. And the thing is that when you're working with somebody like Dr. Hynek, and you mentioned he was the head of Blue Book, but he also took all the real files and started investigating them the way they should have been done. I knew right away from the very beginning that it was real. I mean, everybody asks us, are UFOs real? Well, that's a ridiculous question. Right. The phenomenon itself is real. And I found out by working with the best, a scientist and astronomer. And this happens very often. After these people die, I get very demoralized and I feel, very sad. And right after that, in 92, Hynek died in 1986. In 92, I went to Italy to stay there for 15 years teaching in a private school, and they had found out that I had this UFO research background, and that's when I began working for, Maurizio Baiata in the, Area 51 magazine, and began doing research there, Italian research, and speaking at conferences in Switzerland and Paris and all different countries in Italy, because the atmosphere there was much more serious. In other words, it wasn't as carnivalish as it is in the United States, and they were very appreciative of any information that we had. So I started out, Stephen, with knowing it was real and just trying my best to get disclosure out there. Right.
So that's sort of, and then eventually we met and we identified, a number of people in Italy that were important witnesses who had been airline pilots and military and other officials, and I came over to Italy and to interview them for disclosureproject.org, and you were very helpful, of course, with doing the translation for me and helping to identify these folks and for us getting their testimony. I want to point out to people there are actually some of them that are still in Italian that we have never actually gotten out to the public because we need someone who can do the English subtitles or what have you. But they were very important interviews that we did, including, our wonderful friend Massimo Poggi, who is a commandant of the Italian Airlines, and who was a 747 captain and had a massive UFO on his way, I think, to Brazil from Rome that went underneath his 747 and actually lifted it up as it passed underneath him, fairly close to him. And this is sort of the commandante he was the captain of the captains, I believe, for some time with l'Italia. So.
Yeah, well, he was the youngest pilot they ever hired, but Max Poggi has since photographed 2 UFOs because he's now a private pilot, and somehow they follow him. He's I guess because he got involved with you. No, I'm only kidding. They follow him around, and he has an excellent photo of a UFO in front of his daughter's, commercial airplane. His daughter is now a pilot, and these kinds of people, Steve, that are the real credible witnesses. They're not lying. They know the difference between a weather balloon and a missile and a UFO, and
right.
and they're very respected. I don't know if you agree, but a lot of the testimony in Europe is, taken very seriously and very respected. We don't have that. That's not so much a ridicule factor. It's more of a commercial factor that we have in the United States.
Well, the other thing is that the whole subject here is completely corrupted by the intelligence community seeding people into it who I know for a fact are on the payroll of the intelligence community, who put out false information and all kinds of frightening information. Recently the wife of a major abduction researcher has come forward exposing all of the fraud and corruption that goes on in that field. And in what I found is when I'm meeting with people in Europe, they're much more interested in the serious aspect of this, not only the evidence, because the evidence is overwhelming. I think anyone who goes to disclosureproject.org and looks at, we now have over 550 top secret and military and pilot testimonies. We have thousands of pages of government documents. We have dispositive proof of this. I think the big question that everyone asks who takes it seriously, as opposed to the sort of carnival sideshow that you find in Hollywood and in the sort of book and film industry here, is, gee, what are the implications of this? And as I often tell people, when I was briefing people like the CIA director on this and the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency and members of the Senate Intelligence Committee, none of them were laughing. All of them were saying, well, my God, I have, the evidence here is very overwhelming. Why is this being kept secret from us, these senior officials, and what is behind the secrecy? And that, of course, led us immediately into the whole question of who is keeping this secret and why, this sort of hidden collegium, the secret collegium of folks. And it led you immediately into the technology and the science of this. And because I think that in Europe, that aspect of it, at least when I've been there, has been taken much more seriously, because there is great concern in Europe, I think on average more than in the United States, about climate change and about dependency on oil and the future and what have you. That, when they realize that the secrecy, not totally, but in part, is driven by an attempt to engage in an embargo on the science and technology that would get us off of oil and centralized utilities, it begins to make a little bit of sense. No one really believes that this issue at this point would be so shocking that there's intelligent life in the universe. But I think people, because even mainstream astronomy, or they're finding Earth-like planets around other star systems, and it's a pretty much accepted conventional wisdom in the astrophysicist community that there's intelligent life out there. The question is that if they're here, why are they here, and why is this being kept so secret, and what is the agenda driving that secrecy, and that has been driving the secrecy since World War II or before. And I think that this is what most people who are intelligent and thinking want to know. I often tell this story that when I was briefing a member of one of the royal families in Europe, immediately the question went to environment, energy, science, and technology. It wasn't this thing of, were there little bug-eyed gray creatures doing things sexually to people and all the sort of titillating nonsense that passes for UFO studies in the United States. What I found is that that's really what people are interested in, because anyone who's I don't know how to put this, who's well educated, for example, the CIA director that I spent 3 hours with on this, R. James Woolsey, I thought I was going to have to convince him, quote, UFOs are real, like you were saying. And it was about 10 minutes of showing him the evidence that I had, because I have daytime photographs, all these documents, top secret witness testimony, all the way up to generals and colonels and pilots and strategic air command people. And after about 10 minutes, he says, yes, I know this is real. I want to know why they won't tell me and the president, and why this is so secret that even a CIA director wouldn't be told, and a president would be denied access. And that's when we spent the next 2.5 hours talking about exactly this, the implications of this issue. And that's the part of it that I think is really the interesting part of it, because you can connect that to something meaningful. For example, that if this information can come out, not only would it change how we view ourselves in the universe, which is a philosophical, even spiritual aspect, but people are going to ask the question, well, how are they getting from one star system to here? And when people ask that question seriously, then you're going to immediately get to the next point, and that is that there's a whole new area of science, technology, energy, physics, hyperdimensional or transdimensional physics, that is the answer to some of the world's most pressing problems: world poverty, pollution, climate change, global warming, dependency on Mideast oil, the whole centralized utility system, the so-called grid that's collapsing and could totally fall completely if we had a major solar magnetic storm like we did in the late 1800s. And I think that people realize that we have got to move on to serious solutions. And interestingly, even though this subject is the butt of so many jokes, in reality it's been made a cartoonish sort of subject to hide the seriousness of what's really underneath all the cartoons. And it's interesting because some years ago I got a document from the CIA that, and a lot of people don't realize this exists, but it's out in all our materials. There's so much stuff that we put out that people can't even find half of it. But this particular document talks about, in 1950, I believe it was 51 or 53, the CIA engaging Disney Studios to create cartoons on the subject of UFOs so that it would become ridiculed and diminished in the minds of the people as sort of a cartoonish sort of ha-ha factor, and so it wouldn't be taken seriously. And that's what you see to this day. In fact, you can fast forward to even the last few months of the things that pass as stories on this, and if you go to almost any UFO conference that I've ever been to, I'd say 90% of the time is taken up with either flat-out disinformation and speculative theories, or things that are just so absurd and sexually titillating that any thinking person is completely turned off immediately and forever. So I think that this has been done rather deliberately, in my opinion, and in having looked at these documents and looked at how sort of propaganda and mass psychological conditioning takes place, where people are sort of brainwashed in a certain way of looking at something. It was fairly easy to do on this subject, and they did a very good job of it. And I know an Air Force major once told me that it was really through just sheer ridicule that the subject has been kept secret as much as anything else.
Yeah, Steve, my whole career as a journalist researcher changed when I brought Colonel Philip Corso to Italy, because I got to spend really quality time with this man, and he was telling the truth. And
right.
in my mind, I didn't know why the secret was kept secret either. But when you get somebody as courageous as Corso coming out and saying that he was in charge of the back engineering, now we got to remember this is just for the Army, because if we have crashes as early as 1945, that was Army Air Force. So they broke off into two branches, and God knows what the Air Force had that could have started back engineering way before the Army. But the thing is that it began to make sense because Corso testified twice in Italy. We brought him there on the condition that we bring his grandsons with him, because the reason why Corso even began to talk was because of his family, his children, his grandchildren. And I want to take this opportunity to say that there is a researcher in the field that has been bashing Corso and the ex-defense minister, Paul Hellyer, as being liars. And I think that is shameful, and I think karma has, goes around, comes around. When someone is no longer here with us, like a Corso that can't defend himself, I think that listening to a whole entire lecture on Colonel Corso or Paul Hellyer, or the fact that this cannot be true is not cool. Because Corso was telling the truth, and it made sense, and he was the first one. And at that time, I had people from major corporations that had taken the integrated circuit as a Army request. In other words, the Army had funded their research, come forth and talk to me, one from a major computer company. So I knew I was telling the truth, and it all made sense. That's one thing I wanted to share with you, because the back engineering started way back when, not just in Corso's time. I mean, that's what they're interested in, is the toys. And number two, you mentioned the type of alien, and my research in Italy, not in the United States, shows that the contacts who were made there from the Billy Meyer case on, the Pescara case 1957, Maurizio Cavallo, were human-type aliens. They were people. They were taller than the average person. They had telepathic abilities. They had all kinds of different abilities that probably we have, but they were people. So in my judgment and in my career, I had to shift gears from this ridiculous image of a gray whatever, which is a robotic, type of being, to the fact that we have people visiting us.
Right, and they're intelligent, conscious beings that have developed what we have innately, and that's the ability to have telepathy and remote viewing and higher states of consciousness, which is precisely what cseti.org, cseti.org, is using in our contact protocols. And we've been ridiculed a great deal for stepping into that, and yet when I talk to someone like Dr. Sue Woolsey, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the National Academy of Sciences, and she and I start talking about how these civilizations are communicating across the vastness of space, since we now know they're here. And I immediately start talking about transdimensional technologies that interface with coherent thought, just like light can be coordinated so that the wavelengths link up into what we call a laser, where it's coherent light. The same thing can happen with thought, and there are electromagnetic systems that interface with this kind of coherent thought, which is what what I train people to do. And this is something not understood. People just dismiss it and laugh at it, but it's actually these experiences that people who've had contact have had is opening the door to an entirely new multidimensional reality and physics and science and even spirituality that is just being pushed aside. And what's being promoted, in my opinion, is the false stuff. And I know that Corso, it's interesting because I personally know the Honorable Paul Hellyer, who had been the Minister of Defense for Canada. And, in fact, I met with him very recently here in Washington, D.C., and I was meeting with him with one of the top 14, quote, national treasures in the scientific community in the Department of Defense, who's on our team. And Mr. Hellyer and I and some other people were meeting with this scientist to talk about these technologies. And what I found him as I've gotten to know people like Mr. Hellier is that he's a very dignified and brilliant man who understands the implications of this, the macroeconomic and societal and cultural implications. And he told me personally that he, because he had some contacts in America from when he had been Minister of Defense, that he had asked a general that he knew if this information in Colonel Corso's book, The Day After Roswell, was true. And the general turned to him and said, yes, that and more, and confirmed it. And he knew this man was completely not lying. He was not relying just on what Colonel Corso wrote. Now, I have to say, just in terms of the attacks that Colonel Corso has gotten, part of the problem is that there were people when he was putting that book together who got involved in that project, and I don't want to talk about names, but these are people who are tied into the shadowy interface between the intelligence community and the UFO retail subculture, who were involved in writing and editing that book, who deliberately altered things in a way that put in some factual errors which could be fact-checked and found to be untrue. And Colonel Corso trusted these people to do that. Now, when I was meeting with Colonel Corso's son, he went through this in a great deal of detail. I was at their home. And I said, yes, this is done very commonly, because if you aren't careful, then someone like Colonel Corso, who was getting up there in years, I think he was in his 80s, it's one of these things where they rush that, and then there were things embedded in it, and the term that's used at the National Security Agency. I have a man who spent many years as the right-hand assistant to the director of the National Security Agency, who's this man is on my team. He's my document authenticator, by the way. And he said, oh, yes, we have a term for that, DDT. I said, DDT, what does that mean? He says, well, you set up a distraction and a decoy, and then you put false information in it so it trashes it. So you can take a very good case or a very good thing, and you can put just enough stuff in it so that it eventually gets trashed and pulls anyone down with it. And he says this is done all the time on the UFO subject, and it's done very, very carefully. And this is why UFO researchers have to be so assiduous and so careful, because you're dealing with folks who will stop at almost nothing to try to distort the truth on this issue, to infiltrate and to twist it. I mean, I remind people of the Wilbur Smith document from 1951, when this top secret memo that was accidentally declassified in the 70s, it turns out, where he basically said that the flying saucers are real, that a team headed up by Dr. Vannevar Bush, who headed up the Manhattan Project for the atomic bomb, was looking into it, that they were studying, quote, the modus operandi of these spacecraft, meaning how they operate, what the physics and science was, and, this is the shocker, that the whole matter was more secret than the development of the hydrogen bomb. Now, remember that in 1951, we had not detonated the first hydrogen bomb. That was at Bikini Atoll in 1952. And so here we have a top secret document confirming all of this. It's not contested. There's nothing controversial about it. So if now we're talking 60 years ago, this is 2011, that this level of secrecy surrounded the subject, imagine the kinds of chicanery and nonsense that goes on to alter the message, change cases, and change how the public perceives it. It's been very, very well done. A lot of people don't realize how skilled the keepers of the secrecy are, and unfortunately, Colonel Corso fell victim to some of these DDT tricks as he told his story and as that went to press. And that's part of what happens. And then, of course, there are people who are on the payroll who just go around and debunk and attack people who are doing good work. I mean, I've been called everything in the book, and I really don't care because I'm not running for mayor of Crazy Town UFO community at all. I could care less. My point is that people have to understand if you step into this issue and you start unveiling real information, particularly information that runs counter to the messaging and agenda of this secret government group that's been keeping this secret, then they're going to do everything they have to either defame you, to debunk you, to put poison pills into the evidence, to do whatever they can. And this is a very typical story of what happened to poor Colonel Corso.
Yes, I realized that, and his son had told me the same thing too. And
Yep.
we need to remember that there was a ghostwriter or a co-writer for that book. I'm going to say that much. That Corso was of great interest to a lot of people, especially the intelligence community, because he was coming out with what you're talking about today, which is the real reason for the secrecy. None of us could figure it out before. I didn't figure it out before 1997. I didn't know what it was or why we couldn't talk about it.
Well, I had figured this out in 1992 and 93, and it was interesting because when I was asked to put the briefings together for President Clinton, this was a central part of what we were talking about. And yet the irony here, and this is a delicious little bit of irony, I don't know if I've ever shared this with you, Paula. This is recounted in not as much detail or in my book, Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge, which people can get at disclosureproject.org. But I was invited out to the Rockefeller Ranch, and Lawrence Rockefeller was very much supportive of disclosure, and also even more so of what CSETI was doing with Contact. A lot of people don't realize that. And Lawrence is, God bless his soul, he's passed away. Lawrence and Mary, his wife, hosted us, and of course they hosted Bill and Hillary Clinton there at the Rockefeller Ranch so that they could go through the briefing materials that we had put together and sort of the best available evidence cases that I had initiated and started putting together for the president. But what was interesting is that one night Lawrence Rockefeller pulled me aside, and we went out on this deck there, and they have a ranch in the Tetons called the JY Ranch, and we went out there, and we were by this beautiful, I think it was an original Remington statue with a Native American on horseback with his headdress on and his arms outstretched to the stars, and it's crystal clear, and we're up there at this beautiful place in the Grand Tetons, which is just gorgeous. And Lawrence Rockefeller says, "When are you going to get this done?" And he's referring to getting disclosure and ending the secrecy. I said, "Lawrence, I'm just a country doctor. I'm an emergency doctor in North Carolina. And he says, I said, "We need you to step forward because you're a Rockefeller." He says, "Oh, no, I can't." And I said, "Lawrence, you're old, you're rich, and you're a Rockefeller. Anyone who knows me knows how direct I can be." And he looked at me, he kind of smiled. He says, "Yes, but I have family already jumping up and down on I won't say on what, on my toes, because I'm doing this much." And I said, "Really?" I said, "Just because you're hosting the president and me and these people?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, why?" He says, "Because they have interests that they feel would be hurt," and they're talking about financial interests. Now, it's interesting because his brother was David Rockefeller of Chase Manhattan Bank, which is now, whatever, Morgan Stanley, Chase, whatever conglomeration it is, I don't know. But, what was interesting about it is that, and of course his nephew, Jay, who had been chairman of the Intelligence Committee of the Senate, is from a coal state, West Virginia, where, obviously if this technology came out, we wouldn't need coal, and we certainly wouldn't be involved with the petrodollar, and it would be a totally new macroeconomic system. And so Lawrence here he is, this 80, I guess he was about 85 at the time, very wealthy man, had been everywhere. But he was very clear that, blood is thicker than water. And he was being very clear to me that he couldn't do it. And I said, well, Lawrence, what are we going to do? He says, "Well, you can do it." Now, remember, this is in the September of 1993. And I said, "Well, Lawrence, I'm just, I'm doing this in my spare time. I'm working full-time as an emergency doctor with 4 young daughters." And he said, "Well, it's like a flock of geese that form an arrow and are going through the air. You need to be here at the top end, and I'll be way back here in the back." I said, "Okay, you want me up here at the front taking all the headwinds?" I said, "That goose gets tired after a while," and we started laughing. But it was this very Everyone puts their pants on one leg at a time is what I tell people. And these things become, it's really interesting because when you're with folks like this, you realize that there are pressures, and some of them are financial, but some of them are familial, and then there are others. There are threats that are made and what have you. But there are a lot of ways that the secrecy kind of takes on a life of its own, and in that sort of inertia and the momentum that builds up around the secrecy, we have to have a group of people, the public mainly, that's why I'm talking about this on the World Fusion Network, who are enlightened, who understand the consciousness of the future, and who move this subject into the light and into a positive outcome into the future.
Stephen, when they ask me who in the UFO community is really the most sane and knows what they're doing, I always mention your name. I mean, you're so logical, and you have done your homework, and you have been there, and it's not all hypothetical, and it's real. And I thank you as a researcher for being that goose at the head of the group of geese that are going towards this disclosure. But I want to tell you a story, typically Italian, that'll help you to understand, and you can use it. I give you my permission. When I was doing a lecture in Italy, the daughter of Marconi asked to speak to me, and she took me aside and said, "I have a lot to tell you." But before she could talk to me, she disappeared. I didn't know what happened. And the people who were with me said, "Well, you need to speak to Marconi's assistant, and his name is Pierluigi Igina, I-G-I-N-A. People want to look him up. He's a scientist, and he's up in Imola, and he's about 92 years old." Wow. So after a couple of months, I made my way up there, because this is what I do, all my books, and I've written for all witness testimony and all research that I do, my field research that I do on my own. And I went there, and as I walked into this huge studio, you could see he was an inventor. He had all kinds of things around. I saw on the wall these portraits of these beautiful people that looked like they came from India. They had these beautiful colored robes on. And I said to Mr. Igina, I said, "Did you go to India? Isn't that beautiful, this artwork?" And he turned around to me at 93 years old and said, "No, those are the Space Brothers. They're the ones that gave Marconi and I the ideas, and they're the ones that have contacted us." Right. And I looked at him and I said, "Are you kidding? You mean they're real people? You mean those are people that you've had contact with?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "Not only have they given scientists a download about evolving different technology," and I'm looking at Tesla here too, but they have also met with us to tell us that we better watch what we do in the future. And Pierluigi, was a little bit, he was a little bit depressed, because I guess some of the prophecies he had gotten were not too positive. Right. And that was one of the greatest moments of my life. But this is very Marconi, generated, and I didn't know Marconi was subsidized by the Vatican. And I didn't know that he was involved in 1939 in several things. And 39 is way before even the Philadelphia experiment. So, if people do their research, they will start connecting the dots. That visitations, and I'm not talking about grays here that we're brainwashed to believe, but visitations of real extraterrestrial entities, people, light beings and so forth, have happened for eons.
Oh, yes. Yes, there's a wonderful, in the Uffizi Gallery in Italy, there's a wonderful portrait of the mother, Madonna and child, and there's a beam of light coming down to a group of people behind her left shoulder, and above there is a classic disc-shaped UFO with an opening in the center with this beam of light shining on this group of people in the background behind the Madonna and child. And this has been authenticated to the 1400s. And there's no question, we have never been alone. And we'll never be alone, that there's intelligent life out there, and they're wanting to see us evolve past this current period of enormous chaos and turmoil. And I have heard these sort of accounts about Tesla's experience, but let me just fast forward to the last few months. There are two different scientists we have worked with here in the last year or two with the OrionProject.org who have the highest clearances in the United States And one of them has actually had these ETs materialize in his laboratory. And when he's doing an experiment and he's not on the right track, they actually move the instruments.
That's amazing.
Correct it. And this is someone with the highest security clearance. Another top secret scientist that I'm dealing with. I mean, a man who literally is at the level where he does briefings for Secretary of the Navy and the Vice President and people like this. Actually had an extraterrestrial biological life form appear next to him and drew out on a piece of paper a form. I can't go too much into more detail. We hope to bring this out if we get funding to build a laboratory. But it's obviously a propulsion system. It's amazingly elegant and yet simple and complex all at the same time. And it's an energy and propulsion system drawn by an actual extraterrestrial that fully materialized beside this top secret scientist. And this is a man that I know extremely well. I've been in his laboratory. I've been in his headquarters in Washington. He's a very senior scientist. And yet, when he wanted to leave his position to work full-time with us, he was basically forbidden from doing so for another year or two. So these people who are in these sort of situations find themselves sort of clawed back by, as I call it, the beast. And yet there are these brilliant people who are having, even to this day, these sort of contact experiences who are involved with CSETI.org and DisclosureProject.org. And so, when I talk to people in a public audience, if I get through 10% of this sort of information, it's probably a lot. And it's an amazing story, and we know that Tesla had experiences like this, and I understand that Walter Russell, who had sort of mentored the brilliant scientist Nikola Tesla, who invented AC, of course, electricity and radios and many other things, had similar experiences, and especially in higher states of consciousness. In fact, my home here in Virginia, I actually look up at the mountain west of here where Swannanoa is located, where Walter Russell had all of his gatherings. And so I live in an area where all of this was all coming forward, in the early part of the 20th century. And it's interesting because if you go back and do a sort of a study of this, you'll find that T. Townsend Brown was experimenting with high voltage electromagnetic fields where things were levitating in the late 1920s. And so there have been all these sort of technological breakthroughs for, when I say 100 years, literally over 100 years, trying to make its way through, I hate to say it, the greed and stupidity and the venality of mankind to benefit the earth and the average person. But there's so much power centered around the centralized oil, gas, coal, energy system, macroeconomic system, where everything is on a meter. And, of course, it's reported that J.P. Morgan famously said to Nikola Tesla when he was demonstrating his car that was running on free energy, that he said basically, if I can't put a meter on it and charge people for it, we don't want it, and it's never going to come out to the public. So this is the sort of thing that now, if you fast forward then to looking at the sort of leaps that Colonel Corso talked about with the reverse engineering of advanced extraterrestrial materiel that came from the electromagnetic warfare system that downed the craft at Roswell. And I want to be clear here, those craft did not crash accidentally. I have a document from the FBI from a field agent saying that they had a, quote, new type of radar installation. This is a euphemism for a scalar electromagnetic weapon that was switched on at Roswell that caused these two craft, and there were two of them, to collide, and one went down just to northwest of Roswell. The other one continued on a trajectory going westward and crashed near Socorro. And this is where you get a lot of people fighting because they have accounts from one place or another, and they don't realize there were actually two different craft that crashed at the same time because they crashed into each other, because when this electromagnetic weapon system was switched on, it actually affected the electromagnetic propulsion and guidance system of these craft, and they had a mishap. But the materials that have come from that, and I have to say, I have multiple independent, at least 24 people who've worked on these sort of warfare systems. In fact, one man who had done a lot of work for Hughes Aerospace and a lot of the top defense contractors in the 50s and 60s, he told me that by 1965, we had these kind of electromagnetic weapon systems in space that were targeting extraterrestrial vehicles to, quote, kill them. And, in fact, when they would test some of them, he would see them go down off the coast of California into the ocean, and they would all be jumping up and down with glee that they had killed one. So there's this kind of electromagnetic madness that's been going on, and this is really an existential threat to the peace and the continued existence of the human race. And I remember back in the 90s when I told Mrs. Boutros-Ghali, the wife of the Secretary General, this, she just turned ashen. She says, "Oh my God, can that really be going on?" I said, "Yes, ma'am. These sort of electromagnetic discoveries have been going on for 100 years, and things like Montauk and other places. But unfortunately, we have a group of folks who are madmen, and who have seized this kind of information, and instead of it benefiting the world with free energy and clean energy and propulsion, they're using it to try to kind of do what Werner von Braun told one of our Disclosure Project witnesses, and that is eventually present to the world sort of a threat from outer space, so that they could then expand the whole military, industrial, financial complex into a global concern in some sort of interplanetary conflict and war." And this kind of madness and agenda is which involves trillions of dollars, literally trillions of dollars, is real, and that people have to understand that part of disclosure is knowing the truth about these things, but also knowing what the solution is. And the solution is creating peaceful contact with these civilizations, which is what we're doing with CSETI.org, disclosing this information in a very clear and organized way, and also trying to put together the people who have both the means financially but the scientific expertise to build these systems for peaceful energy generation. Because a lot of people say, well, should this technology even be known? I say, well, it is known, but it's in the hands of the worst possible element now. It's not benefiting the environment and the masses of humanity, and this is what has to change if we're really going to get off of the trajectory we're on now of basically cannibalizing the planet. And there really aren't any other viable solutions. To put a solar system on my house and make the house self-sufficient is about $125,000. And most people are not going to spend $125,000 to put solar on their house. Most people could never afford that. So from a realistic point of view, to get to the solutions we have to talk about these science and technologies and macroeconomic issues, which is one of the wonderful things of being able to sit with someone like Paul Hellyer, the former Minister of Defense of Canada, is that his specialty is macroeconomic systems and studies and the corruption that has gone along with the central bankers and that system. And he's a very astute thinker on this issue.
Well, I did an interview with him on my own dime, which I don't have very much of, in May, and he has written 2 books. The one, The Light at the End of the Tunnel, Survival Plans for the Human Species, which has ufology in it, UFOs, and he talks about the people he's talked to and what the conclusions are. And then the other one, which has to do with the banking system, with macroeconomics. And basically, he is very wise. But Stephen, it always shocks me because when you speak so logical. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure this out.
Exactly.
This is real, and that if we want to change the order, that it must be done now, and these are the reasons for everything. And we're still, even in the, unfortunately, I'm going to say this, in the UFO community, we're back, at sighting stages and, square one, and people refuse to go anywhere here, and...
Right. Well, that's where they want it to be. See, they want it to be exactly where it was in the 50s and 60s and stay there. And this is why, what we've been doing, which have been these breakthrough events. We launched the whole worldwide disclosure movement, and now they're everywhere from New Zealand to Chile to Denmark are opening their files, everywhere but America. And what's interesting is that having worked with senior people in the French government and all these governments, what I found is that there really is a consensus to end the secrecy and bring this information out. However, there is this very powerful transnational secret group that a lot of people do not want to run afoul of because they end up getting threatened or they're afraid of its power. I remember even all the way back in the 90s, I was meeting with a cabinet-level minister over in Japan who had come to New York, and I was up in New York meeting with some folks, and this man, we had this discussion, and I said, Japan could take a leading role because they were very, very favorably disposed to what we were recommending. He said, but they said, no, we cannot do this ahead of this group in the United States and Britain that are keeping this secret. So he was terrified at running afoul of these 8,000-pound gorillas, or not even 800-pound gorillas. And I think that this is the other thing, is that people have to find their voice and their courage to do this, and the average person can do a lot more than they realize, not only in terms of networking and educating other people, but also what we've been saying is that ultimately, if you look at Rupert Sheldrake's studies in morphogenic fields, things change when lots of people begin to do something, and it creates this effect in awareness. It's through consciousness that's transcendental and transcends linear space-time. And one of the things we're doing with the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, CSETI, CSETI.org, is that we're training people to do this. So I actually, before I was a medical doctor, I was a Sanskrit. I used to teach people Sanskrit and meditation and the Vedas. And since we're on the World Puja Network, and of course I do pujas, which are Sanskrit ceremonies using mantras. And so what I found was that there is this direct connection between consciousness and understanding consciousness and being able to make contact, which is why your friend Max Poggi, you and my friend Max Poggi, he has a state of consciousness that is pure-hearted and clear, and I think that's why these ET craft keep being seen around him. And I think that what I have found is that people can learn to do this, and we now have trained thousands of people from every continent who are now going out, and we're just getting unbelievable reports from contact people are having. And this bypasses this very powerful secretive group, because basically it's power to the people. It's citizen diplomacy. And this is what people don't understand, is that we each as individuals have the whole cosmology, the whole universe folded within us, and there's more power within each individual who comes to that state of understanding than they can imagine. And that's why I tell people to empower themselves with this knowledge and then do it, rather than sitting back in a depressed mode saying, oh, these people are so powerful, because to my view, they're a paper tiger. I'm not saying that they're not real, but they have the power we've given them, and we've given up our power, and we need to take it back, not only for disclosure and these energy systems, but for contact, because the ETs are wanting there to be people who are willing to do this in a way that understands transdimensional reality, higher states of consciousness, non-linear communication systems, and to do this within the paradigm of universal peace and world peace, rather than let's see if we can steal their technologies or shoot one down, which is unfortunately the tragic thing, is that in the modern era since World War II, that has been the only quasi-official government response, is either to chase them, shoot at them, or try to capture them. Well, this is a completely backward, caveman-like Neanderthal response to these very advanced civilizations. And I always tell people, who say, oh, aren't you afraid to go out into the stars in remote locations and make contact? I said, oh, no. Scared of what? I said, if these civilizations were hostile, given the fact that they have the means to travel faster than the speed of light, and have been visiting this planet for centuries, if not millennia or longer, if they were hostile, it would be all over. I mean, all they'd have to do is just shut the whole system down, and they could do it in a nanosecond. So the fact that we've been here shooting at them and doing all this crazy stuff, and they have not retaliated in kind, it indicates to me that they're not only very enlightened, but incredibly patient and wise, and incredibly restrained, because I have too many reports of weapon systems that have been trained. I have a man who is an Air Force officer down near MacDill Air Force Base in Florida, where he described this huge horseshoe-shaped electromagnetic pulse weapon. And back when some of the Gulf Breeze events were happening down there, they would turn that thing on, hooked to a satellite, and when they would pick up one of these ET craft, they would hit it with a directed electromagnetic pulse beam that would knock them down. As soon as they materialized out of trans-dimensional space-time into linear space-time, three-dimensional space-time, they would lock onto them and hit them. And he says they would drop into the ocean and they'd go retrieve them. This is recent history. And so if I had one person who was a military officer recounting these things, but I have dozens of them, and it goes back all the way to at least Roswell and probably before. So what I'm saying is that we need to find a more peaceful response that's more enlightened, and that's a key part of what has to happen. And I just want to remind people, we're going to be in Orange County, California, doing a 3-day training for people there in February, and the information for that is at cseti.org. Those dates are February 18th, 19th, and 20th. And then we're also going to be doing a whole week retreat on Marco Island, Florida, March 6th through 12th. And that's going to be limited to 15 people, but it's going to be a wonderful retreat, and the information is at cseti.org for that as well. And then in Colorado, we're going to be in your state, Paula, in
Crestone, right?
Yeah, June 26th to the July 2nd. And then we're going to be back in the crop circles in England, July 24th to the 31st for a week. We hope to have Colin Andrews join us there and a number of other folks. And then we'll be at Mount Shasta August 28th through the 3rd, and then again Joshua Tree October 30th through the 5th. So we'll do a few of these next year, and the people are invited to come. And what I think people have to understand is that this is where you can become a citizen ambassador to the universe and not let the intelligence community and these classified programs call the shots. Now, it doesn't mean that they're still not operational. They are, but we're operational also. And the images, we have these wonderful third-generation night scopes that are hooked to digital cameras now. The phenomena we're getting, the contact we're getting is almost unbelievable. Up to and including about a little over a year ago, an extraterrestrial ambassador from the Andromeda Galaxy that materialized right outside our circle that we photographed. And I think that what people have to understand is that the ETs are increasing their level of contact with people who understand the paradigm of conscious reality and how to make contact. The technology issue is the hardest nut to crack, because so many people who do know these sciences end up being threatened or pulled back into the beast when they start to emerge. However, one of the things that's happened, and this is something that I don't think I've told you about, Paula, in the past few months, I got a file of several thousand documents, some of which are hundreds of pages, that is digital, on a digital disk, that is from a man who worked with a CIA guy whose job it was to go around the world and confiscate these type of energy devices. And it has the diagrams, the seized patents. It has all this information. It's a treasure trove. And what we want to do is put a group of scientists together in a laboratory that we have security around and control, and begin to build these systems up. We have no doubt it can be done. We don't yet have the funding, but, I mean, we have a proposal for about a $5.7 million initial sort of modest grant, but no one on my team has that kind of money, and so we're asking if there's anyone out there who knows of an institution or person who can do it. We've got some of the most brilliant scientists in the world who understand this physics, and we have the detailed plans to do it, but it's going to take a serious, secure facility, well-equipped and well-run and project-managed to do this. I think it can be done. In fact, I know it can be done. But we're going to have to pull together to do it. And that is the next step, because as I see it, somewhere between, 50 to 70%, depends on the poll of the public, now know we're not alone. More than two-thirds of the public believe we're not alone in the universe in studies and polls. And so in that sense, whether there's official disclosure or not, it's a process, because there are more and more governments doing that. What we need to talk about now is continuing the momentum of disclosure, but also having people make contact and the people come together and bring out these energy and environmental solutions that are really at the core of the secrecy, because that is exactly what has to be done if we're going to go on to the next chapter in human civilization, because we cannot do it burning coal and digging up stuff out of the ground and burning it, and oil and all of this. And so it is a transformative moment, and it's a huge challenge. It's certainly the biggest transformation in the known recorded history of the human race that we're faced with. And I'm not sure that the political class has the guts to do it, but I think the public does, and that's why I keep saying if we the people come together, we can do it.
We have a lot of faith in the people, like Gene Roddenberry did in the book The Last Conversation by Yvonne Fern. He talks about the people and how the human being, if given this challenge, will come through. And what you're saying, Stephen, is the marriage of consciousness with science. The science you're talking about will save the planet, the ecology, and the consciousness, the development of consciousness, which really is the overall human being. The intelligence and the consciousness will be the thing that will change the order, that will be the point of contact with these civilizations. And you're way ahead in that you're seeing us as galactic citizens, as members of this galactic neighborhood, which we should have been a long time ago. I don't know, it's taken us years to get it together. And having faith in human beings gives me some hope, because often as a researcher, kind of doing the grunt work, I get very discouraged.
Yeah, well, you kind of have to look at the glass half full and go. I tend to want to be a person that's looking at the potential and not of where we can be, rather than just stirring around the darkness of the current problems, because as Einstein said, no problem has ever been solved by the level of consciousness that created it. So we have to bring a whole new vision to this, and the vision has to be one of a peaceful world civilization going into space peacefully with these new technologies in a just macroeconomic order, so that we eliminate the poverty in the world. This is all doable. And interestingly, if you really study this issue, like you were talking about, going all the way back to Marconi, going all the way back, the potential for this has really been around for 100 years. And this is what's, in a way, people get very frustrated when they hear that. But I said, in a way, it's a very promising thing, because what that means is that everything we need to know is already here on Earth. All the science, all the technology, the consciousness, it's all here. We've just got to put it together and move it forward as the operational paradigm. Right now is sort of on the fringe, but it needs to move as the operational paradigm. And that's been the problem, is that there are so many powerful interests that haven't wanted to see that happen, that they keep stopping it, and they're very skillful at stopping it. But I think that's what, to me, this existential struggle is about transformation. And you cannot let the bastards grind you down, as you two said in the song, as Bono said in the song. You just kind of have to keep moving forward, and knowing that the winds of the universe are blowing in our sails, that basically this is the direction that the cosmic forces want it to move in, and the extraterrestrial beings want it to move in. But they're not going to land on the White. It's like when Larry King asked me, well, why don't they land on the White House lawn? I said, well, why? They'd just be blown out of the sky with a missile or worse. This is a process that is about consciousness and are taking action. And usually the last people to kind of move in a direction like this are your hidebound academics and your political and moneyed classes. It's us ordinary people, and I put myself very much in that category, who really come together, create a field effect in mass consciousness, and move in that direction together. And that's when we do that, that's when the magic happens, and that's what we have to come together and do, in my opinion.
Well, your Rio Rico event is in my brand new book, which is called, it's my last exopolitics book, by the way, because I'm moving on. It's called Exopolitics, Stargate to a New Reality. And since I've developed some protocols for exopolitics, one of them is the contact. And for me, the CSETI protocol is the only one that works. And, I was at Rio Rico. I covered that story. It's in my book. With all the testimony of pilots, and I do very much the same thing as Leslie Kean did in her book, and get all the testimony of these pilots and astronauts and people involved, because my theory, Stephen, is that 100 years from now, some students in a university are going to go to the library, and they need the first-hand witnesses. They don't need gossip. They don't need internet. They need the word-for-word interview of the first-hand people. And I've provided that for them in my books because that's all I do. I just do that part and get
really
their
wonderful
testimony.
Right. Well, thank you for doing the work you're doing. It's been wonderful, and it's been really a great pleasure to know you over the years and to work together. And I hope to see you again soon. We're about out of time here for this interview. It's already been an hour. It's hard to imagine. We have to do this again, Paula.
Yeah, I'll see you again. I usually see you once or twice a year. For the people that want to know about the 1945 crash, it's another one of those witness testimonies, and it is on my website and in my new book.
Well, why don't you give them your website?
Okay, it's www.paola, because I'm Italian, PaolaHarris.com, and my website has all the breaking news, including that group that's meeting in Saudi Arabia on June 23rd, and you must have heard about that.
Oh, I thought it was January 23rd.
January 23rd,
right.
And I'm wondering what the three UFO people, Jacques Vallée, and Nick Pope are doing.
Yeah. I have my own theories about that, but I think I'm going to be at the Sundance Film Festival. I've been asked to go there when that's happening. So,
good.
Yeah, it should be interesting for Sundance to meet with some people about getting the truth out. Well, look, Paula, thank you for everything, and good luck to you in your work. And
thank you.
I'd like to thank you for being with us, and I'd like to thank the wonderful people at the World Fusion Network for hosting us every 2 weeks. This has been Conversations with Dr. Greer, and this is Dr. Stephen Greer. Keep looking up, and God bless you.